Hello and welcome to the Soft Skills Salon with your host Diana Kowarski. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Bill Coda, the founder of Corporate OD Associates, which is a company offering a full range of training, organizational development, and consulting services. Diana and Bill begin by discussing how the current hybrid and virtual work environments have shifted the reliance on specific soft skills. They continue the discussion by considering how one's brand or image can be impacted by their speaking and writing skills, especially among junior employees. Lastly, they offer guidance on how one can demonstrate confidence and instill that confidence in others. Now, let's have a conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Soft Skills Salon podcast, which is an audible think tank on soft skills. I'm Diana Kowarski, your host. As I say, conversation is the currency of communication. So let's have a conversation. And our current episode is one where I have the privilege of welcoming Bill Coda, who I will hold as both an esteemed colleague as well as a friend who I've had the privilege of co-facilitating and instructing with in the past. Bill Coda is the founding person of Corporate OD Associates, founded in 2002, and he did so after a 25-year career in the financial services sector on Wall Street in New York City. During his career, he worked as an auditor, banker, learning and development director, and senior HR professional for PricewaterhouseCoopers, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Merrill Lynch. Since 2002, Bill has partnered with hundreds of organizations globally across many industries to help improve their bottom line results. His practice focuses on both live and virtual classroom facilitation, performance improvement, professional coaching, and enhancement of interpersonal skills, sales, negotiation, and communication skills. Bill, awesome to have you here, and I'm so glad that you made time for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And although we physically haven't seen each other in a couple of years, I really remember with great memories about all of the classes that we've gotten the opportunity to co-facilitate on the soft skills, which to me, when we use the word soft, people think, well, it's different than professional skills. I think they're both hand in hand and just as important, if not more important than the technical skills.
Fair enough. Thanks so much for that, Bill. And thanks so much for going through that soft skills impact questionnaire. And there's a couple of questions that we're going to use as a platform for this conversation. And the first is this. How do you compare pre-COVID soft skills to what I've labeled as moving beyond COVID soft skills at work? And if I may, Bill, I've tried to bring as much positivity as well as realism to not using post-COVID, because I don't know what that means. So right. Moving beyond COVID was the best I could come up with. Nonetheless, the question is, from your perspective, a comparison of pre-COVID to what we've got going now with Absolutely. The soft skills world. Go for it.
And I think you're right on target, Diana, because one of the things is certainly we're not post-COVID yet. And what we're looking at is really a fundamental switch in the way business is being conducted. And I don't think that's going to end when this pandemic ends. So one of the things we have to think about is, what is the new environment going to look like? And how are we going to manage that split between virtual or the hybrid, as opposed to for folks like myself who have been around for 30 plus years, where virtual, almost everything was done in live meetings. As technology had progressed, we had started to use things like Zoom and virtual meetings and team meetings and things like that, more for a cost efficiency. But because of the pandemic, our whole life got turned upside down. Right. And what we have to do is think about, how are we going to, especially for the younger folks who have been dealing with this maybe the last 3 or 4 years, it's just been the very early parts of their career. So as opposed to the managers and the directors and the senior vice presidents who were really used to seeing and managing, and sometimes unfortunately micromanaging the workforce historically. So there's a really fundamental change here. And I think being able to deal with ambiguity, being able to manage change, being more resilient, and understanding that we're not going to have those organic discussions when you walk from one cubicle to the other. And you're not going to have the opportunity to have informal chats with people because you'd have to schedule a Zoom call, or you'd have to think about, how are we going to facilitate this with 4 people and their schedules. So work certainly hasn't gotten easier. In some ways, it's become a lot more difficult from a logistics standpoint to manage.
Absolutely. And there's so much in what it is that you have already said. And a few points that jump out at me in particular is having a perspective in terms of what pre-COVID versus this current state and moving beyond into the future, hopefully in happy, healthy ways. Looking at it from a level of career experience, whether you are, newer to your career or more seasoned, not necessarily age specific, because careers are not, determined by one's age necessarily. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts more on how younger people who maybe the majority of their careers are newer to the workforce, how some or the majority of their career might have been COVID versus those other folks who have been around for a while or who have more entrenched work where COVID has been a blip on a longer scale.
Absolutely. And, for those managers / directors, maybe they were baby boomers who started in the 70s, their careers in the 70s or the 80s or even into the early 90s. They were used to the more traditional methods of control. They were used to the more traditional methods of management. Younger folks these days have to work much more independently because they don't have the daily interactions that maybe each one of us had early on in our careers. So the ability to be proactive and a self-starter and to still know that it's great to ask lots of questions. Don't feel like you don't want them to feel that they're drowning. So younger workers many times feel so isolated over the last few years. And in my opinion, and what I've seen over the last few years is even if it's a Zoom meeting, it's an opportunity for them to interact with other human beings. So they try to maximize the use of their time and their energy. And I think it's really critical that for folks that have been around, for 25 plus years, that we recognize and appreciate that and not get frustrated, because eventually things will kind of calm down. But we have to think about, well, what are the expectations of the millennials or the Gen Zers in terms of how they're going to attack or address all the work issues that we traditionally addressed differently back, 2 or 3 generations ago.
Absolutely. And, pardon me, your words remind me of, I guess we used to call this a leadership technique, and it was management by walking around. Do you remember that? That was the MBWA.
MBWA, that was a big topic. I remember that.
And in your comments, I was reminded about management by walking around, which really did take a toll on staff's independence. In fact, it was a way of, at times, unfortunately, micromanaging or of having a presence. Pardon me. So not able to manage by walking around. Whether or not it was the right choice, I think, is a whole other topic for us for another time. But you're right, the independence on the other side of that coin that folks who are newer to their careers now are being required by default to have. Perhaps, more tenured people are a little less comfortable with that independence because it's really new, right? If you historically have been doing this management by walking around, transitioning to virtually doing so is almost impossible. And it's a different set of values you're displaying for the other staff.
100%. One of the things that's interesting is that, traditionally, you've been able to have a ad hoc meeting, pull 3 people into a conference room. You've been able to discuss issues and see people's reaction real time, frustration or anger or uncertainty around different things. And now when we have scheduled meetings virtually, it adds a very different element and a different dynamic to the way people interact. People are much more distracted, unfortunately. They're more on guard. It's the first time maybe they've been able to interact with their colleagues in a while. And one of the things that I think it's been a nice positive and a surprise for many people is that over the last few years, productivity has still seemed to be very high, if not even more high, because we take out the commute time, we take out the sort of downtime, and we realize that the time that we do spend is very focused, and people aren't working less, they're actually working more. Emails can come in at any time, or phone calls come in at any time, and people are willing to field those calls at 8 p.m. or 6 a.m.,
I think you're right. Our orientation towards time in 2 particular ways, that ad hoc meeting no longer really being a viable option, or not necessarily the same kind of option it was pre-COVID. And suddenly we have this perhaps new appreciation for what we would have said was serendipitous or even accidental communication, that suddenly now we realize that there was a lot of value that we may have garnered, or even some, points of innovation and intersection of information when we overheard, hey, is that what you were talking about? Or is this in relationship to that? Or, those hallway or even elevator chats that just don't happen. You're absolutely right. And as a result, our orientation to time has greatly changed. And I don't know if there's any prevailing thinking yet about how it is that the subtraction of commuting is necessarily adding to our overall day, and how individuals are during this COVID era, as you said, managing their emails around the clock, perhaps in our North American context, versus some of the European countries. For example, France, I think it's at least 5 or 6 years ago, if not longer, made work hour emails and non-work hour emails pretty much, I think, if not greatly discouraged, illegal. Is that to your knowledge as well? Is that resonate?
Yeah, there were some. My recollection that was in Germany because of the worker unions, and probably in France as well, because they have very similar, in terms of employee protections and employee rights and things like that. But most people in the United States and Canada probably have the opinion of, well, in order to keep my job and my career, I need to be responsive, and I need to be available, and I need to show up. And it used to be if they saw you in the office for 10 or 12 hours a day, that was showing up. Now it's hard to tell when you show up unless you're signed in on your laptop or your meetings, back-to-back meetings. And I'm sure everybody has a level of frustration. And there was already, prior to the pandemic, a very big shift in the expectations of the new workforce. For managers who have been around maybe 20 plus years, there was very rarely a questioning or a challenging attitude. And I think the newer generations were much more used to feeling that, let me challenge the status quo and turn things on its side, which then just got completely, exacerbated with the pandemic.
I think you're right. And that pandemic giving us a global experience, or at least all of us having access to a global narrative, expanded on what may have already been swelling in terms of questioning or thinking about how, even at junior levels of authority, we can put a thumbprint on a process or a task, which, 20 years previous was an unheard of idea. It was the way it was, right? We just didn't do that. I love the idea that, and I'm not sure how we can reconcile it, there's a difference between pre-COVID FaceTime and COVID era online or exposure time or responsive time. I think there's some sort of an equation there to think about even more. Thanks for that, Bill. We're going to talk about your next chosen question, which I'm very excited about, which is number 8 on our list. And it reads, What do you recommend others do? What do you recommend others do to improve their soft skills based on your experience? And I would say here, as facilitator, instructor, thought leader in training and professional development and coaching. And I'm sure that you got plenty to say on this one.
Yeah, well, thanks, Diana. And you know what? There are many things that people can do to improve their soft skills. And I wanted to really just focus on two that I really think are going to really make a difference. One, and probably no surprise to you, Diana, but I think as good as your communication skills are, they can always get better. And we look at it from two perspectives: writing skills and verbal skills. And I think, unfortunately, very few people write clearly, concisely, and persuasively. So enhancing those writing skills, I think, are critical in order to ensure that either your personal brand, your message, your image, your reputation is consistent across the board. And we have to think about, asking questions and listening. Those are some of the other communication skills that I think are critical. Asking questions and having a curious mindset, drilling down and saying, why is this happening? Don't just take the first answer as the complete type of, definitive answer. Think about, if it doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense to other people. So listening skills and keeping those distractions to a minimum. It's very hard to practice listening skills, but what you can do is think about playing a tape in the dark and just listening for what are the three main things that this person's trying to say, even if it's a book on tape, and understanding. One of the things that I think is really critical in terms of improving soft skills as you move on in your career is understanding that there's some key differences between managing and leading. And you don't have to be a manager to lead. You can lead from the beginning of your career. So people look for leadership skills. We manage tasks and we manage people, but leaders inspire. So look for skills about how we can be persuasive, how we can move people from doing what they think is good to stretching their limits and even doing better.
Absolutely. I knew you'd have some great stuff to say on this one, Bill. And to go back to one of your original points, that divide of verbal skills versus written skills. And, in my career path, there's been a love-hate with many of my clients in offering writing skills and or teaching writing skills and how to coach on writing skills, because at times it has been on trend and at other times it has been thought of as almost a punitive skill set, right? If you're hired by X bank or by X, global organization, of course, you know how to write. It's just assumptive. And to my experience, echoing your own, not really.
100%.
And so with the writing in particular, I love how you connect it to individual brand and individual image and individual reputation, and by extension, whole team and even being ambassadorial for an organization and building that whole brand in an industry, for example. The other side to that is I always try and have clients focus on the readers and let them know that it's in those readers' heads that brand is solidified. And how does that idea get in their heads? It's through the words that are written, right? And so I've got a lot of passion around writing skills. I wish that it was better understood as non-punitive. And, to echo your comments, as an example of communication skills, they can always be improved upon. And
Absolutely.
I'm sure, for example, both of us having taught writing for as long as we have, that we could probably even talk about when email was new. I know I remember. And the writing shift that many people struggled with.
Absolutely. And, it's very interesting because one of the things that people tend to forget is that writing can take on many different perspectives. And there are different types of messages that we want to send. So an internal email should not anywhere near resemble a formal presentation or a report that we're making. So we need to adjust our styles, and we need to think about adapting to what the audience is that we're writing for or that we're presenting for. And technology has made some big leaps there in terms of presentations. And the way we present virtually is going to be very different than standing physically in front of a room with 20 people listening to us or 200 people listening to us. So we have to keep in mind that what are the needs of the people that we're going to be presenting to, whether it's presenting via the written word or presenting verbally, and try to adapt to that. Let's face it, many people are advancing their careers because of their technical expertise, whether they're accountants or bankers or IT or engineers. So that's their strong suit, the analysis, the technical competencies. But what we need to do is think about, regardless of what your individual career is, the communication skills, the management, the leadership are going to cross through that. And those are the things, as you get to be more and more senior in your careers, that take on increased importance.
Absolutely. And a theme that I have coming up in my thoughts in response to the great words you've just spoken is about the thinking that you mentioned, right? The curious mindset, or the phrase that was introduced to me, or at least I was reminded of recently, was having a beginner's view, take on a brand new person's perspective, right? Having a new view, which I think informs a curious mindset. The idea here with asking questions and that whole comment that you've made about thinking, about trying to think about, what are the three salient points that you even mentioned in listening to someone, and thinking about your thinking. That idea of meta thinking, or cognitive awareness, I find very interesting, because it also extends to writing. And what I hear you saying is, think about the reader, think about what you're writing, which is a parallel skill set to the writing. And it's in the thinking about what you're writing, or the thinking about, as you just said, what you're presenting, in a who is this audience? Who is this reader? Who is my intended listener? Which is the application of some of that communication, as an example of a soft skill that, you're absolutely right, can be applied successfully if you're coming from a healthcare perspective, an analytical perspective, an IT perspective, a hedge fund management perspective. In that way, it's trying to ask people to think before they speak, almost. And I know it sounds simple, but what do you think?
I agree. And we have to remember that there's such a fine line between the content, which is one part of our message, and the way that content is delivered, which is just as important. And I think most people worry about, if they're putting together a PowerPoint presentation, do I have all the information there? If they're putting together a memo, how much detail can I give? What we need to do is really tailor that down to say, what are the key points that people that are going to be reading this or listening to this need to take away from this, to make sure there's alignment, and to make sure that if 15 people are receiving my email or listening to my presentation, and I'm standing in as an interviewer as they exit that room, are they going to come away with a consistent message? Because if our message is diluted by the way we present it, we're really doing everybody a disservice.
It can lead to great distraction, can't it? And if we're distracted, there's no way I'm going to be able to successfully have understood your main focus, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It becomes putting the cart before the horse, really, when you think about it. How am I going to ensure that every single leg on that stool is holding equal weight? And if we just focus on one of those legs, whether it's content, whether it's delivery, or whether it's a combination of the two, we're gonna probably not be as successful as we look at it more holistically.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a connection, a great segue here. I have that stool image in my mind. I think the three-tiered approach in terms of presenting and thinking about your content and the thinking that you're doing, that lends itself very nicely to the next question for us to consider. And it's also one of my favorites, which is, how do you define confidence? What comes to mind, Bill?
And I think, when I saw that question, it really struck home for me, Diana. I think confidence and confidence can take on many aspects, but there are some fundamental things that run threads that run through everybody understanding what confidence is. And it's not being assertive. It's not being overly aggressive. It's really being able to adapt to the approach and to the expectations of others. It's number one, being prepared, being a subject matter expert and knowing that people are going to use you as a resource. That instills confidence in others. So you may be confident, or other people may even have more confidence in you if you tend to be more on the humble or the introverted side, but you're still exuding confidence in others. Having those technical capabilities and the technical competencies so that people start to trust and not question everything that you bring to the table. And being consistent and reliable and following up are really important pieces of confidence. So what we want to do, and I think one thing that is emphasized, and I think it's critical, is being able to employ empathy in all kinds of situations. People that are confident realize that they're not right 100% of the time, and they're looking at other people's points of view, and they're looking at things from different perspectives and trying to use that empathy to come to whatever the best solution is for the problem.
So much is in there. And I've had several guests grapple with this question. And I know I have thought about this and rethought about this. And some of the experience that I'm sure we both bring in terms of assertiveness and or how it is that one can present themselves. Over the years, there's been a lot of different theories. You might recall power poses, right? And the idea of standing like a superhero in order to bring on this, I suppose, feeling of confidence, which perhaps works for some and perhaps not for others. In comparison to those sorts of trends around confidence, I've heard several guests, and I hear this echoed in your comments, and it's a mirror image of my own thinking. It's about knowledge in some way, shape, or form, about the knowledge that you have, no matter how small or how grand that knowledge may be, but that firstly, you have figured out what it is you bring to the table. And it might be something quite specific and finite. So if I'm, a newer member to the team, it might be, I know about this based on my 3 years at that bank before I got here and the 2 days that I've been here. And having the self-awareness to really at times maybe white knuckle my hold on that knowledge, I think there's something there that then I can package information to inspire trust, which is that word that you spoke that often doesn't get brought in the mix with confidence.
Absolutely.
But the other side to that is if you believe you honestly deserve a seat at the table, that it's not until you have that belief that I might also believe you deserve a seat at the table.
100%. And one of the things that's so interesting about what you just mentioned, Diana, is, and thank you for reminding me, I think self-awareness is critical. And it's one of the pillars of emotional intelligence, as you know. And being self-aware and knowing what your strengths are, what you bring to the table, as you just said. And then knowing that you're not going to be able to solve everything on your own. And looking for those opportunities to collaborate with other people who bring equal things to the table as well, instills confidence in the entire team. So for those people that, as you said, grandstand and have that power pose, that's a lot of theatrics. But you can be very quietly confident by bringing lots and lots of thoughts and lots of options to the table and letting other people share their opinions as to what might be working in their favor or they might have some questions about.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add that oftentimes we mistakenly look for confidence as some sort of flipping of a switch. But certainly that's what those power poses were all about. I'm not confident, flick, now I am confident. However, I would suggest to you, again, based on some of what you've offered, the idea of consistency and reliability and follow-up. We show those qualities, those choices of behavior over time. And sometimes there are, periods of intense work where we have many, many opportunities to demonstrate or to fail. Other times, depending on the nature of the work, it might be much more protracted. However, confidence, I'd suggest you, has some, and I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is, but it's over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. I agree, because you can have initial confidence, and we all hear the expression first impression, but over time, confidence and continued repeated efforts build that trust. You can't trust somebody until you know them for a while, and until you've either interacted with them as a subordinate, as a colleague, as a direct report. All of those things then build that confidence over time, and that trust will build slowly and incrementally. And we all know that can be decimated in a moment if something happens where you break a trust or break a confidence or all those types of things. So what we need to do is constantly be aware of what it is and how other people are viewing us as a resource, as an ally, or maybe as a foe. And, so much of what we do in business is psychology related, I believe, and just the examination of human behavior.
Yeah, it really is, and we like to pretend that we don't bring our humanity with us in some industries, right? We like to pretend that we don't have feelings in this office, or that we don't have all of those other aspects of being human. And yet, whether it's a virtual office or a hybrid or in person, you're absolutely right. We're still trying to figure out the best routes to connect. And often it's through those soft skills choices, those communication choices, that we get there. And, it's the same idea behind this podcast. And that is that us having a conversation in the hopes of bringing a little bit more insight, maybe hindsight or even foresight into what it is that has been in our worlds, in the hopes of helping other people in their own career paths. With that in mind, is there any resource, Bill? Is there a website or a book or anything that you could mention that you think might be of value for folks if they're interested in doing this?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that question, Diana, because there's so much out there. And I think you're going back to my comment earlier about having a curious mindset. I unfortunately don't go to the library as much as I used to, because now everything's available to you online and virtually. So that's, again, a big change. But I'm a big fan of TED Talks, and probably, if you don't know what to look at, just put in a topic, and at least a dozen TED Talks will come up around that topic. One of the most powerful TED Talks I've ever seen was by a professor named Amy Cuddy, Cuddy. And Amy's a professor at the Harvard Business School, and she talks about professional presence in a very succinct and in a very engaging way. So I would recommend, if you have not seen that you take advantage of looking at it. It's about 15 minutes, 20 minutes long, and it's really powerful, and I use it in a lot of my training. In terms of an author, one person who I've really grown a great deal of attachment to is Malcolm Gladwell. And I'm not sure how much our readers or your listeners know who Malcolm Gladwell is, but Malcolm Gladwell is a psychologist, but he's really written a number of books, The Tipping Point, The Outliers, that really talk about how human behavior impacts work. And I love Outliers in particular, because he talks about what is it that differentiates those exceptional performers from the average performer, and what qualities do we look at, and how do we continue to enhance all of those things that will not only take our productivity, but our results and all aspects of our life. It's not necessarily just business related or commerce related, but to accomplish a great deal in our lifetime. And what's our legacy going to be? how are people going to remember us, whether it's because we leave a firm or a company or once we pass on to the next life? What are people going to say about us? And I think, so I would say Amy Cuddy's and really many of the TED Talks, and then in terms of an author that I would love to just throw out there, it's Malcolm Gladwell.
Absolutely great references. And Outliers is I think the subtitle is something along the lines of how to succeed, or the story of succeeding, or the story of success. So it's a great read. And I would add that there's some remarkably easy to follow, not TED Talk, but YouTube videos that Malcolm Gladwell has made available that I completely support all of the writing. So lots of resources there.
YouTube's another great resource that I forgot to mention, but you're right. I mean, my kids remind me of it all the time. If you don't know how to do something, YouTube it and you'll figure it out. It'll figure it out.
That's right. Eventually it'll all come together, right? So Bill, this is where we have all come together, and I want to thank you and do so with great appreciation in investing this time and in sharing your expertise. Fantastic chosen questions and insightful answers. So thanks so much for making the time, and I hope for you to have continued success as long as you're willing to share it with your coachees and your clients and all the great companies that you work with, Bill.
Well, thank you, Diana, for the opportunity, and I'm hopeful that as you continue to broadcast these podcast messages, that people see that there's lots of different ways to get to where they want to be. And I think it's a great service. I think we can constantly be learning, and we can keep on looking at things from different perspectives and figure out that there's not one right way to get there. There's many.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Bill. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.